All right, guys. So I wanted to do a quick recording of the lecture from last week. I thought that I did this, but I did not. So I'm going to do it now. We had a few people that weren't there last week, so I'm going to go ahead and get this recorded for you guys. Do a quick voiceover, and then as soon as it processes, when I get home tonight, it'll probably be done by then. I will download it to YouTube, and then I'll email it out to you guys, and then also post it on Moodle. Okay, so guys, we've been referencing this material. This is an intro to healthcare economics, right? So we've kind of shifted away. Um, we're starting to shift away from healthcare innovation and quality, and then getting into kind of the second area of the course, right? Which is healthcare economics. So when we talk about this, we're going to have to also kind of try to conceptualize and define some really classic economic definitions um, before getting into kind of how we apply this to the healthcare system in general, right? So that is why we're covering this basic information. So here's the deal. I mean, obviously, when we talk about healthcare economics, right? Healthcare economics is essentially a subset of economics that focuses on the healthcare system on both at a system level and then also on the level of the individual as well, right? So when we talk about individual decisions and actions that people take, right, inside of a market, right, that's a microeconomic component to the system. Okay, conversely, when we talk about system-based decisions and actions, right? Those reflect the macroeconomics of the healthcare system. So when we talk about economics, and this is really every decision that we're going to talk about is going to kind of fall under this umbrella, right? How do we explain behavior, right, in the context of limited resources? And that's what economics does. Economics is a social science that attempts to explain human behavior in the context of limited resources, right? Um, and so that affects obviously how we make choices, given the availability of a good product or a service, right? And so when we talk about economic analysis, what we're going to talk about, and to be clear, right, economics classically is a field that involves a lot of math. We're not going to spend a lot of time on math in this class. As far as the down and dirty math of economics, but we are going to, excuse me, talk about economics classically and talk about a lot of these definitions, uh, and particularly as they apply to healthcare, right? So when we talk about economics, we're talking also about regulation of supply and demand, right? Those are really the two components that drive economic activity. So what is a market? Okay, a market is essentially includes all buyers and sellers for a specific good or service, right? And so buyers, we also refer to those buyers as consumers, and the sellers are also referred to as producers, right? So patients in the healthcare system are often referred to as consumers of healthcare. But there's kind of an interesting kind of relationship, so to speak. Healthcare providers are often referred to as producers. However, the systems in which healthcare providers find themselves can also take on the role of consumers as well, right? As they attempt to essentially maintain a supply of healthcare workers, supplies or services, right? So they can also be consumers. So there's a really interesting kind of duality there. Okay, so when we talk about equilibrium, right? Equilibrium is essentially that ideal balance between supply and demand, at which consumers essentially pay the right price, right, for a good or service. So producers obviously produce an optimal supply of a good based on demand, right? And if consumers make an excess of a good or a service that 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 exceed the demand for that, the price drops, right? And then obviously, if there's less than what is demanded, price goes up. So obviously, the higher the supply and the lower the demand, right, price goes down. But if supply is low and demand is high, right, then price goes up. So there's a bit of an inverse relationship there. Okay, and we can actually see um, the demand curve obviously sloping downwards here from the on the left from top to bottom, and then the supply curve sloping up here. Okay, and obviously the lower the supply on the left, the higher the demand, right? The higher the demand, the higher the price. I'm sorry. So price being that the function of obviously supply and demand. Okay, scarcity. So we talked about this. Okay, so scarcity refers to essentially the fact that all of us face limited resources, right? No matter what it is, even those with resources, depending on what the need is, can also face the problem of scarcity, right? So obviously, as people, we want to optimize our choice, right, based on our current resources and the relative scarcity of the item, right? So I gave the example in class last week of cranberry juice. For some reason, I cannot get enough of cranberry juice. It's just like those. It's the bomb. So every time I go to the store, I look like an absolute crazy person because I'm walking through the store with like 11 bottles of cranberry juice, right? And I don't just like the regular stuff. I like the natural stuff without all the sugar. Yeah, the tangy stuff. That's where I'm at. And so that stuff was like 12 bucks a bottle, right? So I have a bit of a conundrum, right? I can, obviously make use of my resources either in a way where I buy the expensive cranberry juice for 12 bucks a bottle, or I can essentially get more of that product by buying the lower cost, potentially higher sugar cranberry juice, right? That costs less, and I can get more of it, right? So that's one example of scarcity, right? Is me wanting to try and maximize the quantity of that good that I can actually get, right? I may buy something at a lower price to be able to essentially get more of that, right? So the way that we actually kind of understand this is that scarcity places has the function of placing constraint, right, on our ability to consume, right, either positively or negatively. And so, one example of this, at least in healthcare, is the rise of generic medications, right? So there's obviously there can be an option to choose between the name brand of a drug, right, and its generic counterpart. Oftentimes, right, maybe early on, those generic drugs have not necessarily undergone, rigorous testing and non-inferiority trials and those types of things. And so people may be more hesitant to trust a generic drug as opposed to a name brand. However, right, over time and with increased use, once that generic, uh, you know, drug has become accepted, we may achieve a new state of market equilibrium as the supply of that drug actually increases and demand actually begins to level out, right? And that can affect the price. Okay, market efficiency, right? So efficiency essentially measures how well resources are being used to maximize the production of goods and services, right? Um, so essentially, we say that something is efficient when we can achieve no greater good or no more productivity given the resources that we have, right? So obviously, when we talk about the healthcare market, we also need to kind of discuss the topic of essentially benefit relative to cost, right? And that's actually part of what insurance helps regulate as far as as far as the cost of certain procedures, right? As we talked about in class today, uh, that is where deductibles can actually be beneficial, right? They can be negatively cost effective for simple problems and of limited complexity, but then we have potentially large scale medical needs with high levels of complexity. Deductibles can actually be financially protective, right? Um, Additionally, also information that's completely essentially representative of what can be known about the market influences its efficiency as well. As we'll talk about in a minute, there are two main reasons why healthcare markets fail. One of those being an externality, and the other being a lack of information or information asymmetry, right? When we don't have all the information that we need about a problem or about a market, right? So obviously that lack of information and or that asymmetry can cause the market to fail. Okay. So market failure essentially happens when markets don't promote efficient uses of goods and services. So market failures can happen, like we said, for any reason, like information asymmetry or information that's imperfect, right? Same thing, right? Externalities, monopoly or oligopoly. So when we talk about an externality, that's essentially where the buyers and sellers in a market do not directly benefit, or at least benefit fully from that good or service that they are either producing or consuming, right? So monopoly obviously is when you have one one group or one essential one firm that's essentially in control of an entire market. That's monopoly, right? And then there's an oligopoly, so where we have a handful of systems or firms that are essentially controlling the market. We talked about an example of that is in the Twin Cities. Very often you'll see only maybe 4 or 5 different markets for healthcare services. Health Partners, Park Nicollet, Allina, right? Independent providers such as TCO for orthopedics, and then also obviously Abbott, those types of things. So, and that's basically those are basically the options for healthcare in the larger metropolitan area, right? So that represents a bit of an oligopoly. Right. So the reason why market failures are important is because they result in suboptimal benefit, right? When a market fails, right, people, whether they be consumers of goods and services or whether they be producers of goods and services, do not fully benefit from the market, right? And as we'll talk about later, in a perfect market or in a perfectly competitive market, uh, people are fully benefiting um, from the exchange of goods and services inside of that market, right? Okay, competition. So competition obviously occurs when highly efficient use of resources results in increased supply and reduced costs. So we gave the example earlier of a generic medication. Okay, we give the example here, excuse me, in this on this slide of essentially a kind of an innovative tool that hit the market several years ago by the name of the KardiaMobile and/or AliveCor system. So this is actually at the time when it first came out was a 2-lead ECG that you could lay flat on a table and/or attach to the back of a smartphone that would take an ECG tracing, and you could actually send that information directly to your doctor, to your cardiologist, right? They have actually, this company has now actually even improved the device to actually make it comparable to a 12-lead ECG for detection of atrial fibrillation, VTach or ventricular tachycardia, uh, and then I think those two rhythms, and then yeah, I think that's it. But they have essentially forced the market in and of itself to become more efficient by producing similar technologies that can provide comparable and or better information to providers when it comes to patient data, right? And so competition is good for the market because it actually forces the market to become more efficient, right? And drives costs down. Um, so definitely a good thing. All right. So obviously, as we talked about, economics is kind of a social science of that examines how we make choices in the face of uncertainty and with limited resources. So opportunity cost obviously refers to the consequences of choice in regards to mutually exclusive alternatives. So what do we mean when we say that? So one thing that we often talk about when we talk about opportunity costs is, just as an example, is it better, right, to pay off debt, or is it better to save, right? What should you do? Should you focus on paying off your debt, um, in lieu of saving money, or should you save, right, in lieu of paying off debt? And so that's an example of how we utilize opportunity cost. And we'll continue to talk about that when we talk, as we continue to talk about healthcare economics. So marginal benefit refers to the benefit from continued consumption of a good or service. Okay. And so ultimately, the example that we give here is that marginal benefit over time tends to decrease with the same with continued consumption over time of a good or service. So for example, we gave a kind of a different but I think easily understandable example here. Um, purchasing an additional vehicle, maybe every year or two, right? How much benefit do you really get from purchasing an additional vehicle every year or two? Okay, is there a point at which the benefit of that additional purchase is outweighed by the cost? And the answer classically within economics is yes. There is essentially diminishing marginal benefit with continued consumption. So marginal cost refers to the additional cost of consuming or purchasing the next item, right? So with every unit of a new item that we buy, there's obviously an additional cost, right? And so in order for there to be total benefit, obviously that benefit must always exceed that cost, right? And the same is also true within economics itself, within the healthcare economics. All right, guys, that is it. So I'm going to give this time to process, and by the time I get home, it'll probably be done. So I will post this as soon as the process is. So look for an email, hopefully from me, God willing, tonight with a YouTube link. Okay, thanks, guys.